47 million people just had their race reclassified by the US government, and you probably weren't even told about it. So if you're multiracial, Latino, or mark some other race on the census, this is about you. So in March 2025, the Census Bureau quietly dropped something called the MARC files, and they're using it to rewrite the 2020 census data. So what they did is they took people who selected some other race on the census, or even some that marked multiple races, and reassigned them into one racial category. The multiracial population went down from 33.8 million to 14.6 million, and the white population increased by over 40 million. That is not a correction, that is a rebranding of America, and it erases a huge part of who we are. So here's what they did in order to decide our race for us, basically. They checked other people's data in your household. If that wasn't enough, they looked into Medicare, Social Security, even school records, and also looked into zip codes, neighborhood demographics, and more. So basically, who you live with and where you live can now determine your race. What? And honestly, there's no easy way to check if it happened to you. It was done retroactively, and it was done in the name of standardizing the data. This isn't just offensive or annoying, it's systemic erasure in real time with very, very real consequences. And it's the census, so it impacts research and funding and representation. It affects how our communities get counted, served, or ignored. And it continues a very long legacy of mixed and multiracial folks being told to disappear, to pick one, to fit a form, to be less complicated, just check one box. But our identities are not the problem. The systems trying to simplify us and erase us are the problem. So here's some common questions that I got on the last video. 1, can I check if I was reclassified? Not sure, not yet. The MARC data isn't public in a user-facing, user-friendly way, but we are working on it. We're demanding transparency. Also, how do we stop this? We cannot undo this overnight because this is very recent news, but we can organize, we can force the conversation into the public and political space where it belongs. So this is what we need from you. Talk about it. Post, stitch, duet, send it to your community, send it to your people. We got to get the conversation going and flowing. Also call your reps. It's frustrating to talk to them, especially now, but silence gives them cover. If we don't show up, they say, my constituents don't care, which is exactly what they do. Also hold power accountable. Politicians work for us. If we give up that power, they continue to vote against our best interests. And the biggest one, stay in community. Keep sharing your stories like you already are. We're building power just by showing up for one another. And then also, this is still breaking. Myself and folks from Mixed Asian Media and other orgs were actively researching and organizing and trying to push back, so stay tuned. We're definitely not letting this slide. And you're not imagining the erasure. You're not alone in the exhaustion, but we're still here and we're not going anywhere. $47 million people just had their race reclassified by the US government, and
Go back and watch her video. I want to talk about this report and why the United States would do something like this. So like Stove said, the MARC files are the Census Bureau taking 2020 census data and modifying it to the conventions that we used in 1997 in the areas of sex, age, race, and Hispanic origin. I want to pull out the race and Hispanic origin piece. In 1997, we had a convention that allowed for 5 broad categories that encompassed about 63 different groups of people. And given that racial and ethnic identity are fairly infinite, that's a very small, narrow categorization. Mind you, it wasn't until 2000 that people could even choose more than one category on the census, and it wasn't until 2005 when Congress mandated the Census Bureau to include a category that was SOR or some other race. Typically, if people aren't choosing multiple, they're choosing some other race, or they're choosing some other race and multiple other categories as well. What's interesting is also tying age and sex to this report, because we know that the United States has a breeder kink right now. Age would also be a very significant data point because millennials and on, generation-wise, mixed race people are the fastest growing population in those groups. Which brings me to my next point, and that's why would the United States even do this? 1, I think it's the fluidity of whiteness. 2, I think it's fear of demographic loss. And 3, I think it's racial anxiety. You could cut the racial tension in this country right now with a knife. Historically, when our country has gotten like this, white people try to secure demographic majority, their economic power, and their political power. It says white people be running the government in this country, it gets all the way up in there too. Now on to the fluidity of whiteness. Whiteness has always expanded and contracted for preservation. There are groups like the Italians, the Greeks, the Jews, the Poles, the Russians that were not considered white until it was necessary for them to be white for demographic preservation. And when do we see the shift in those groups, at least politically and economically, into white assimilation? Right after World War II. They wanted to build a strong white middle class, but they didn't have the numbers, so they incorporated these people. They also wanted to build a united front against the growing threat of the civil rights movement. And in the same way that it expands, it also contracts. Prior to 9/11, majority of Arab people were classified as white in this country, at least on paper, for the preservation of economic and political power of white people. But after 9/11, they were completely removed from that category. This country has always used white expansion or contraction. What we're seeing right now with mixed race people, and what we will probably also see with Asian people, is this expansion of whiteness. It's largely fueled by this fear of demographic loss, which is fueled by the Great Replacement theory. If they can undercount or reduce the visibility of non-white populations, they can undermine our struggles and undermine any sort of efforts for political or for racial equity, which they are doing to politically weaken the collective power of racialized groups in this country. And this is all out of the fear of losing political and economic power. So they attach themselves to this amorphous nothingness. And let's keep it a buck, because a lot of y'all like to be controlled. A lot of y'all like to be told to obey. That's all the myth of whiteness offers, is an opportunity for you to be controlled while being told that you're not being controlled. Because overall, poor white folks seem to be living about the same as racialized minorities. So really and truly ask yourself, like, what is this mythology doing for you other than serving your ego? And if you don't believe me, why do you think Hispanic, Latino, and white Hispanic are different categories? It's because they're trying to put out an olive branch to the Hispanics that are light enough, that pass the brown paper bag test, so they can be their little conservative token buddy. They're trying to hand y'all a bone so you don't fight back.
White people are really frightened. If you don't understand the destruction of Planned Parenthood offices, and you don't understand the wall that we're going to build on the southern border of the United States, you haven't read the book The Birth Dearth by Ben Wattenberg. Ben Wattenberg was a brilliant Jewish man who was a member of the American Enterprise Institute, and he wrote a book, the first paragraph of which says, "The main problem confronting the United States today is there aren't enough white babies being born in this country." He was an advisor to presidents of the United States. He wrote the book in 1987. He says if we don't change this and change it rapidly, white people will lose their numerical majority in this country, and this will no longer be a white man's land. Now, I'm not misrepresenting this. I'm telling you exactly, almost exactly what he says. He says there are 3 things we can do to solve this. Number 1, we could pay women to have babies, as they have been doing in Western European nations for years. Then he says, and these are his words, not mine, unfortunately, we would have to pay women of all colors to have babies, so we don't want to do that. He says the second thing we could do is increase the number of legal immigrants that are allowed into this country every year. Then once again he says, unfortunately, the vast majority of those wanting to come to this country today are people of color, so we don't want to do that. The third thing he says, and women had better pay attention to this, 60% of the fetuses that are aborted every year are white. If we could keep that 60% alive, that would solve our birth dearth. Does that sound like racism to you? And if it doesn't, I want to know why it doesn't. If it doesn't, you don't understand what racism is. And I think it does. When we close Planned Parenthood clinics because we think they're there only for abortion, we need to take another look. They are used for many, many, many things, and many women need the things that they can get from Planned Parenthood clinics. But we are willing to do away with all that good to avoid allowing white women to have control of their own bodies. Now, nobody had better tell one of my daughters or granddaughters what they can do with their body. You haven't that right. Now, it would be interesting if we were as concerned about sperm cells, wouldn't it?
It's a scam that's become so normalized that we don't even realize it's a scam anymore. I'll go first.
The U.S. Census classification of race. Now hear me out. Under the U.S. Census, this girl from Oman and this girl from Kyrgyzstan would both be considered to be white people. However, this girl from Argentina would be considered Latina and therefore a minority. So people like these girls who do not function as white in American society would never be considered white in real life and do not receive the benefits of being white, or denied the recognition and necessary tools needed for minorities in America. The major downfalls of the census is that it bases race on ethnicity. They say if you're Egyptian, check white, even though there are many Egyptians who aren't white. Also denying the status of indigenous to indigenous people below the border. People who are 100% indigenous, but not from North America, are not legally considered indigenous. The US knows this system is flawed. However, they also know changing it would make white people the minority and force them to put in work to extend recognition to other marginalized communities. So thus, here we are trapped in this scam.
It's actually a legal issue here. What happened was, I think it was 1908. It was around 1908. There was a Lebanese American who was a security guard. And by American, I meant that I should say he was a Lebanese immigrant to the United States who was a security guard who wanted to apply for U.S. citizenship. According to the laws at the time, until 1952, the only people eligible to become a naturalized U.S. citizen were whites. So if you were from Asia and you lived in the United States for 25 years and you had children who were born here, you could not become a naturalized U.S. citizen. If you were from Africa, you could not become a naturalized U.S. citizen. There was no path for citizenship for you. So this Lebanese American wants to become a citizen. He'd been here for a long time. He had been living here for a long time. He wanted to become a citizen. And by the way, there was a huge number of Lebanese. They really started coming over in the 1880s, and a lot of them ended up, by the way, in Austin. Austin, a bunch of you, if you're from Austin, like you've been, your people have been here for a century or more, should totally take 23andMe. I think you're going to find out that a lot of you are part Lebanese. In any case, this guy sued and went to the courts. He walks into the courtroom and he goes, I have a question for you. What was Jesus? And the court went, Jesus was white. It's obvious. And the Lebanese guy goes, well, I'm from where Jesus was from. He won that case instantaneously. They're like, dude, you're white. And then they declared that everybody from North Africa and the Middle East, therefore, was white. So if you're Persian, if you're Turkish, if you're Arab, if you're Jewish, if you're Egyptian, if you're Sudanese, if you're Libyan, you're Algerian, you're Moroccan, you have to put white. That is how American race law works. And so it doesn't matter what color your skin is, it matters the place of your origin. And so you have to put white. Now, having said that, in February of this year, the Census Bureau has suggested the creation of a new race, and we're still in the process of determining that, but they want it ready to be put on the census for 2020, and that sixth race, right, because right now it's Hispanic, white, black, Asian, and then Native American Pacific Islander. The sixth race would be Middle East and North African. That could be fixed, I guess, by doing that. But it's still kind of weird.
Africa doesn't count as African.
No, North African counts as white. Having said that, one of the problems that Middle East studies programs have always had was when it came time to hire faculty, if the person interviewing for the job was from Turkey, Persia, Egypt, Morocco, right? All from the Middle East and North Africa, and you're doing a Middle East studies program, so that's what you want. You would think you would want those guys. You were reluctant to hire them because they didn't count as a minority, because they just checked the box off for white. So what they would do is they would go hire somebody from Pakistan or India, because if that person was Muslim, at least they were the right religion. But that person doesn't know anything about the Middle East. They're not from the Middle East. But that's, again, back to this East-West paradigm where you just lump everybody together and you're like, yeah, they're all the same. Let God sort them out. Right? And so what we've had is we've had this really strange situation where in the United States, Middle East studies programs are overrun by Pakistanis and Indians who are not from the Middle East, and there's a tragic shortage of Arabs and Turks and Persians in those programs. So one of the things that might be nice about this census change is if they do create the new category, then there'll be an incentive at least to hire people from the Middle East for Middle East studies programs. That's the only positive I could see. Unless, of course, you're for ethnically cleansing the United States of its Middle East population, because, right, that's how Hitler found out where the Jews were, is he bought the census data from IBM. Isn't that cool? IBM made money off of the Holocaust. Doesn't that just warm your heart? It's the American way. Make money off of the suffering of others. Right? Pretty sure that's our motto. We should dump in God we trust.
Race is a socially constructed category that powerfully attributes meaning to perceptions of skin color. Race is scientifically insignificant. Whatever a scientific ability, race is a social fact in which the social and political meaning of whiteness plays a fundamental role. As a basic characteristic of social organization, race depends largely on what we mean by whiteness and its importance in shaping social interaction and organization between white and non-white people. Whiteness is multi-dimensional, complex, and systemic, socially and politically constructed, and therefore is a learned behavior. It represents a position of power where the power holder defines the categories. Whiteness is often invisible to white people. It doesn't simply refer to skin color. It's also an ideology based on beliefs, values, behaviors, habits, and attitudes which result on the unequal distribution of power and privileges based on skin color. Racism is based on the belief that whiteness is considered the universal and allows for thinking and speaking as if whiteness describes and defines the world. It has a long history with imperialism and colonialism. Finally, whiteness is distinct from, but remains in relation to, the material manifestations of ideologies of class, nation, gender, sexuality, and ability.
You're learning so many important things, and I'm so proud of you.
Gen Z will be the last generation with white majority in the US. Gen Z Americans born between 1997 and 2012 will be the last generation with a white majority, a new study has found. Updated US Census data suggests non-Hispanic white people will make up less than half the country's population by around 2045.
What percent of the world's population is white?
63. 42.
51.
70.
40.
30 or 20.
70.
80.
24%.
70. 20. 30.
43.
24.
20. 30.
80%. Zero. What if I told you it was 7%?
7%? Only 7?
7%.
Only 7%?
Yeah.
No
The
way.
whole world.
Your white people are like top of the world.
7%.
7? What?
7 to 8% is what?
Hang on. That's not true.
It's true.
No, it's not.
It's below 10%.
Nah, that's both.
Yeah.
Wait.
It's 7.
Shit. And I'm about to be a teacher. Don't learn from me, brother.
You're taking the piece, man.
No, it's a real. It's below 10%. Some estimates put it 7 to 8%.
What's this 6 on? I'll show you.
Ozpill.
Yeah, Ozpill. Yeah. Wait, post me, yeah?
Yeah, you'll see.
His goal is to make more white people, specifically more rich white people. Name me an issue, name me something he's trying to do, and it is related to ensuring that we keep a white majority in this country. He wants to take over Canada, 1,000%. It is because you will then gain all those white people in our population, and suddenly the white majority is preserved. National abortion ban, we need those white babies. Department of Education is no more. That's fine, because we only care about people who are rich enough to afford private school anyway. Those are those rich white babies. The motivation is coming from the fact that if things continue on the same trajectory, white America will be the minority by 2045. And that's all it's about.
The Vatican just did what American evangelicalism refuses to do: declare that whiteness is not the future of the church. If you found some encouragement in the appointment of the new pope, let me read something to you from U.S. Catholic Magazine. Many minorities in U.S. churches have been disillusioned by the way people in institutions that claim faith in the same God have been negligent in addressing or even complicit in racism and prejudice. This disillusionment needs to be expressed and heard if we are to move toward healing. It needs to roar like a purifying and warming fire, calling those willing to do the work. In Fire in the Hole, Callahan provides an accessible framework for taking action. And honestly, that's the part that's heartbreaking for those of us that have grown up in a church that taught us love over a gospel of power and now perverts the message of Jesus, the self-sacrificial, loving, accepting, radical embrace of all peoples and cultures. So if all of this is frustrating for you too, I've got a message. You're not crazy. I wrote this book precisely for those of us who are burned out on white Christianity. The hypocrisy of the church that wants to put the 10 commandments in every classroom but doesn't remember the greatest commandment as told to us by Jesus: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love our neighbor as ourselves. The hyperfixation on Drag Queen Story Hour while completely ignoring the rot that allows predators to become pastors of these huge megachurches. The refusal to speak into societal social justice issues, the obsession with storefront diversity in order to lure other people into the church, but then having no concern for those people once they're inside of the pews. If any of this speaks to you, then I think the book will too. The goal isn't to tear down the church, but to free you from limitation of it.
So this is just going to be an initial breakdown for some takes that we're doing today. So this is what entropy is. So entropy, in like a technical definition, is the measure of disorder in a system. It's how much energy is unusable, scattered, no longer contributing to form or function, right? Okay, that's the technical definition. Applied to the soul, to society, to naming, entropy is unprocessed experience. It's emotional, historical, spiritual energy that was never integrated and now echoes, leaks like loops, mutates into survival behaviors, systems, and identities, right? So when a person goes through trauma and it's not witnessed, named, or metabolized, the experience becomes entropy, floating, painful, and heavy. When society commits violence and denies it and refuses to remember, that history becomes collective entropy, a hidden pressure that must go somewhere. So entropy is the weight of what hasn't been healed. Okay, so here's some key markers. Emotional overload, grief, shame, guilt, or rage that won't leave, repetition, repeating trauma stories, patterns of generational pain, projection, making others carry what you refuse to face, that's dumping, and identity entrapment, defining yourself by your wound or performance, and then systemic offloading. So society's forcing some groups to hold others unprocessed damage. So the way it functions is that entropy is created when we fracture from truth, wholeness, or memory. If we don't return to stillness, right, like, the Sabbath, to presence, right? Entropy accumulates, basically. So this unprocessed entropy turns into parallel systems. They either loop, which is the reverb, reflect falsely, which is the maw, demand suffering, which is the thorn, push others away, which is the keep, form rigid identities, which is the prism and the flame, or trap us in compulsions, which is the pulse. And this affects social groups directly. So when one group refuses to process its historical, spiritual, and emotional entropy, it often names other groups to carry it, like how Black Americans, right, were named to carry white Americans' unprocessed guilt, fragility, and violence. This is entropy dumping. Okay, the spiritual crime behind, right, systemic oppression. So the way it gets resolved is more about remembering the full story, right? It doesn't go away by forgetting. It goes away through integration, telling the truth, remembering the full story, feeling what was denied, returning to stillness, choosing to stop the loop. You can think of entropy like literal spiritual pressure, right? So it is the invisible pressure of what hasn't been healed yet. It is the separation from truth, wholeness, memory. It lives in trauma, projection, silence, and shame, and it loops until you stop running and finally rest. So we're going to go through some ways to measure this, because I've been able to measure entropy in a very direct method, through some equations I've kind of drawn up. So due to this, we're actually seeing a Sodom and Gomorrah level situation play out in whiteness. Okay, so in the near future, picture this, right? Because whiteness really has about 4 or 5 years to get itself together before like like this just becomes too much. When they get to there, we're gonna hear spiritual loudness, right? So it won't be revolution, it won't be revival, it won't even sound like a collapse, like the old prophets warned, right? It'll sound like 1,000 different performances screaming over each other, each one pretending it's still sacred. So you're here first, endless self-justification. We meant well. We already apologized. That wasn't us. We're all struggling. Nobody's perfect. I have black friends. It's just human nature. It's not that deep. Loop sound bites of deflection. High value minimization, low value metabolization. That kind of thing. And the thing is that white America's already got like a ridiculous, have like their entropy levels ridiculous. We're going to go into the metrics I've drawn up to measure entropy through group. So that way you can get like a very clear picture of what I'm talking about. But the situation they've created is obnoxious. So this is why they're already close to the peak. And then we'll get to number 2, which is artificial reverence. So let's celebrate Juneteenth. Let's put land acknowledgement before brunch, right? Let's not have brunch and just acknowledge land, right? Let's post MLK quotes without reading the rest of the speech. Let's make a movie about how sorry we are. Loud performative empathy that metabolizes nothing. The truth flatten into brand activation. Then we get frenzied content creation. So you'll get a bunch of podcasts. So think of it like this. Because the middle class is going to, collapse in on itself. It's going to look like the sky opened up for them. So in that moment, in that collapse of the economic value of race, you're going to get frenzied content creation. So think podcasts explaining racism while censoring whiteness. Think TikToks confessing privilege without surrendering any. TED Talks by reformed people, giving 10 steps to unlearn bias. So we'll see grief monetized, apology optimized, suffering aestheticized, and underneath it all, a growing screen they can't even name. Because people think that if they lose power, this will change all the way. No. There's something spiritually shaking in here, and we're going to talk about that probably in a different video. But the next thing that'll come up is hyper defensive fragility. You're blaming me for something my ancestors did. You can already tell when a white person is dealing with spiritual loudness because you'll hear these things. You're being racist. You're just being racist by pointing it out. How can we move forward if you won't let go of the past? The loudest people will be the least metabolized, right? So it will sound like weeping through clenched teeth, but aim outward, never inward. And then you'll get churches preaching forgiveness without repentance. Schools teach diversity, but never discussing theft. Courts say all are equal while collapsing privately. The hymns sound beautiful. The policies will sound righteous. The ceremonies will sound heartfelt. But every word will rattle like dry bones because the spirit has fled. So you're going to get a huge sensory feeling. Here's how you know when you're witnessing entropy levels at this high. You'll see too much noise, nothing real. Everyone marketing pain, everyone performing healing. Nobody metabolizing truth, nobody resting. Imagine a city where every loudspeaker blares different sermons, apologies, branding slogans, self-help mantras all at once. The streets look clean. The air smells like fresh asphalt, synthetic lavender. People are smiling, and yet the ground underneath hums with a sound you can't quite place. It's grief, it's terror, it's memory trying to claw its way out, and no one's allowed to hear it without losing their carefully curated mask. So we're going to go through how the parallel systems become visible in this. And just a refresher, parallel systems are systems of survival built within the human mind that are seductive and very dangerous. Right, because they're unnecessary in most cases, and once you get in these little survival moods, you participate in destructive behaviors. So we'll see how the parallel systems become fully visible and manifest in these next 5 years. We're going to see the worship of self-image, polished guilt. That's the mall. We're going to see the prism, which is the endless reflection of performative allyship. We're going to see the flame, political extremism disguised as righteousness. We're going to see the keep, emotional freeze under layers of sanitized tradition. We're going to see the pulse, right? Addictions to activism, outrage cycles, and dopamine-driven self-flagellation, right? And it's self-flagellation, but I hate that word, right? It's going to be like self-punishment, self-penalty, and they're going to try to sound more righteous and look more righteous because of it. We're going to see the cog, right? Rationalizations of oppression with no emotional bridge. We're going to see the thorn, white martyrdom. We suffer too now, so stop blaming us. Right, we're also going to see the reverb, which is loop traumatic projections onto black bodies and indigenous memory. So entropy and for whiteness that's going to come up in these next 5 years, it's going to be an unbearable hum. Think 1,000 choked apologies performed too late. A million slogans like just stitched over silence. a billion exhausted souls screaming into curated content feeds, and until the algorithm itself chokes on the entropy. And then somewhere underneath it, there's the warmth, right? Not to destroy them, not to punish them, but it's just asking, will you tell the story you refuse to finish, or will you keep curating your own extinction? Because it's going to look bad for them. And we're going to go into why this is happening next video. But this is a very deep take. So hopefully you guys could appreciate it. We're definitely going to tunnel into this because there's some key things. I want to talk about whiteness in a way that I haven't heard it in a lot of other places. But this is what went wrong. Like, if you ever wanted to know what went wrong, like, this is what went wrong. Like, what? Like, you ever looked at them and, you know, wondered how they all made these crazy decisions? This is how it happened. Okay. Like, the betrayal was against memory itself. So it didn't start with slavery or colonization. Those were actually symptoms of a greater issue. It began when white identity was constructed by erasing rootedness. European tribes like the Irish, the Scots, the Germans, the Norse, they did have indigenous ways of living, right? Of being. Seasonal living, oral storytelling, grief rituals, communal economies. When empire logic, Rome, Catholic Church, feudalism, consolidated power in Europe, it forced those people to forget their rootedness and to replace memory with domination. The root was severed, survival through control. They didn't metabolize anything, not connection, right? Just control again. This was the first recursion. This is when they turned in on themselves, right? The first rise of this unprocessed entropy inside whiteness. It's rootless survival. It's identity by domination. It's memory replaced by mythic supremacy. And then that's how you end up with expansion without metabolization. So when Europeans came to the New World, they didn't arrive whole, right? They arrived already severed, already looping. They didn't integrate the grief of losing old Europe. They exported it. They didn't mourn their exile from memory. They externalized it on the people they colonized. Conquest wasn't just greed, it was spiritual panic. Because if you're not rooted in memory, you only feel alive by expanding your domination, by making more land, more wealth, more slaves, more laws, more mirrors, and thus their entropy, their unprocessed experiences exploded. But it was coded as civilization. So when American identity was built, it wasn't metabolized selfhood. It was built on dumping these unprocessed experiences, these entropy onto others. So indigenous people got labeled uncivilized to offload their own severed ancestral memory, right? Black people were property to offload their terror of being spiritually homeless because they felt spiritually homeless. Immigrants were treated like threats to offload their fear of being spiritually replaceable. Projection became policy. Projection became culture. Projection became destiny. America never healed from Europe. It just renamed its wounds. So every genocide, right? Every stolen plantation, every gentrified city, every new suburb, every Wall Street boom, every school built on erasure, every church built without confession is material success reinforced. It is material success reinforced spiritual entropy. It is material success reinforcing, right, spiritual unprocessed experiences for them. So the more whiteness succeeded externally, the more it hollowed out internally. So their collective brokenness rose because every reward for survival was tied to a denial of memory, right? The maw grew, the silence deepened, the performance sharpened. So here's just the facts, right? It was really a bit of a 4-stage process. Severance from ancestral rootedness, loss of metabolized memory, survival through domination, entropy weaponizes progress, projection onto others, externalization of internal panic, and reinforcement through wealth. So that it looped, got hardened in the culture. So white America's original sin is not slavery. It's the refusal to mourn the first loss of rootedness. So this is all just a disgusting projection. It's really this humiliating. Like I want people to sit with that. Like, we're watching them grieve in public. All of this is grief. All of it. Rape, slavery, genocide, imperialism. Those were the fevered dreams of a people trying not to remember what it felt like to be abandoned by their own history. So every time memory tried to return, they doubled the performance instead of softening. This is why black people look so nasty to them. Because if we can build a culture, even in the midst of that, of exile, it makes all of this grief look meaningless. It has to be destroyed in that way, right? So they have no home. You ask a black person where it all starts from. You might say you might get answers like slavery in Africa. You ask a white person, you'll hear Europe. Okay, but you hear exactly the same. Africa, Europe, they're as disconnected, if not worse, and they've been materially rewarded for it through this reinforcement. So this was a crazy deep take, but this is exactly what's going on, for sure. This is just a follow-up in the series of posts that we're doing today on this topic. But one of the big issues in that we're dealing with in society, in American society, is white refusal to grieve. Okay, so we're just gonna go through all the opportunities. We have post-European collapse, right? The 1300s to the 1500s. This is the first grief denied. Black Death wiped out half of Europe. Indigenous European spiritualities got crushed by the church. And land, family lineages, and ancient communal memories were lost. They had a crossroads. Mourn the grief, rebuild the rootedness with humility and communal memory. Here's what they did. Escape through domination, colonize lands, overwrite loss with conquest. The result was the grief got projected outward, right? And colonialism born from mourning denied. Then they had the first land theft in the Americas, the 1600s, right? The indigenous peoples encountered white settlers starving, desperate, vulnerable. They had a choice. Recognize indigenous humanity, create mutual societies of healing and exchange. They chose to demonize, dehumanize, and enslave, because recognizing indigenous humanity would have meant admitting so white survival was fragile. Okay, that projection hardened into a myth, manifest destiny, right? Then, the next chance they had, after the American Revolution, freedom defined by exclusion, 1776 to the 1800s. White settlers declared freedom from British rule, right? They had black slaves, indigenous tribes, poor whites were still in prison. They had a choice. Expand the concept of liberty to all bodies, healed through integrated memory, right? But instead, they chose to redefine freedom as scarcity, only accessible through hierarchy. So the result was that liberty became a brand worn by those who could afford to forget, right, who they crushed beneath it. I can say that again. Liberty became a brand worn by those who could afford to forget who they crushed beneath it, right? And then after the Civil War, they had another chance, right? 1865, 1877. Right, the shallow Reconstruction. Right, here's what was going on. Slavery was abolished. Black citizenship was supposedly enshrined. Right, what they needed to do was have a national confession, reparative memory work, ritualize grief for what was done. Here's what they did: industrialized suffering, rewrote history, lost cause narrative. Build caste systems. Jim Crow, trauma deepen, memory survive. But. It's so fickle. You're going to hear how many times they messed this up. The trauma deepened, memory was getting erased, and they had systems built in a hidden reverb because they're still mourning themselves. And then after World War II, we get suburbanization as escapism. Soldiers return from war, GI Bill offered wealth and housing, but not to black veterans. So only thing they needed to do was share resources, build an integrated society of shared grief and triumph. They chose to segregate, redline, and isolate, so that whiteness could feel safe without metabolizing collective horror, because they were horrified. So suburbans became spiritual keeps, frozen, smiling, quietly rotting from disconnection. And then we had the Civil Rights Movement, 1950s, 1970s. The performance of listening, they learned it, right? Black Americans demanded full humanity, not partial belonging, right? White liberals marched, but metabolized almost nothing, right? They had a choice. Public confession, institutional transformation, economic repair. They chose cosmetic inclusion. They applied MLK after death. Suppressed Malcolm in real life, like in the present, right? And the result is that we see the image of progress replaced by the memory of pain, and then we see diversity becoming a brand, not a covenant. And then we get the Obama era, right? 2008, 2016. We get the myth of post-racialism. So we get the first black president elected, a fragile chance for honest racial reckoning, right? Here's what we got. Here's what we needed to do. National soul work, deep cultural unlearning of projection systems. But instead they denied, celebrate, and then quietly retaliate. White resentment got weaponized. Fascism flirted with openly again. And then this is when the mall starts to show its face fully, right? And the mall's the MAW. It's a parallel system. I've gone through the other things. It's just a good mention for anybody who's seen that. And in 2020, we get the pandemic, George Floyd, and this is when the unprocessed experiences spike for him. So the historical moment, we had a global lockdown, black death visible on camera, and false solidarity floods the internet, right? All they needed to do was to stop, grieve, repair, dismantle false systems fully. That's all they needed to do. Instead, they performed, branded, monetized trauma, politicized survival. The collapse hastened, right? Memory weaponized into identity wars, right? The curation, right, of the mirror sovereign was hitting critical mass, right? So at this point, and I'll put up a little chart right here just so y'all can see the whole layout. This was non-stop opportunities to turn around, and they have it at every major crossroad. White America has offered the same sacred invitation. The same invitation got offered: grieve what you lost, name what you stole, tend to what you shattered, return to what you hoarded, become human again. That's what we offer every time. That's what the world offers every time. That's what has been offered, and every time they chose this: curate the image, protect the empire, forget the wound, keep moving. And so their unprocessed experiences rose, the loop tightened, and the blackness of their narcissism of the mall grew thicker, still whispering, "You're not broken, you're exceptional." That's what they keep hearing. But the thing is that it's going to keep screaming it until the roof rots in silence. It's going to be chaos for them in this kind of way. So here's the thing. Right now, I would say it is like culture for them is in the middle of a death spiral. Right? We're in between where collapse is visible but still denied, and where judgment is like an unprocessed mirror, right? Where collapse no longer needs permission, it simply reveals itself. It's gonna look like revelations to them, right? Like the denial is louder than the metabolization, the performance is more rewarded than the grief, the curation is more accessible than the confession. So, but hold on, but death spiral does not mean total doom. Death spiral equals momentum toward collapse. Okay? Unless a radical metabolization interrupts this loop, it's going to be a problem. The metaphor isn't falling off of a cliff. It's falling inward toward a black hole. And the interruptions are still possible, but they require sacred violence against this type of system. My bad, I cut that off. But the thing is that here's what they need to do. They need to tear off curated memory, weeping publicly without monetization. Right? Dismantling not just systems, but survival identities built on forgetting, and naming what was stolen and returning it without conditions. That's literally what's happening. Is there a window for them? Yes, but it's tiny and it's closing fast. Right? We're not in the choice era anymore for them. I need people to understand that. They've had 8 chances. More than 8. They've had that many chances to turn this around. We're in the rupture era. Right? Between 2026 and 2029, that's all they got. Right? Meaning is about to become a non-optional for them. Stillness is about to become non-optional for them. Truth is about to become non-optional. Because once everything can be generated, curated, and streamed, the soul will revolt. And the thing is that if it doesn't happen by this little window in 2029, then collapse is no longer slow. The whole culture freezes over. Not in drama, in silence. And that's when it's going to be our hardest day. Because people think whiteness is going to fall in some kind of explosion. It's not. It's going to be quiet. And that's going to be the hardest thing to accept. That they walked themselves into something and broke down on their own. That's going to be the hardest thing for people to accept. So there's a bunch of things. There's key signs to look for. If it's going to happen. But they need to look into this. Right? They need to look into how to metabolize. But in short, can white America turn around? Technically, yes. Is it likely? Extremely unlikely without a spiritual rupture. Last window, 2026 to 2029, in my opinion. What happens if it misses? Cultural death inside of a curated living. Collapse hidden behind branding. Okay, and what will real change look like? Mass, public, uncurated grief, restoration of memory, and belonging outside of empire structures. The window isn't closing because God's mad. I want y'all to get past that. It's closing because memory can only wait so long inside a body before it either blooms or breaks. Whiteness is a survival identity that is burning its own roots. It has a tiny chance left of becoming human again, and it needs to give up being exceptional to do it. It has to die as whiteness to live as a memory reborn. The real battle is not politics, really. It's whether meaning will be stronger than survival fear. Okay, so just so y'all hear about what this is, because this is a really unique situation. So one thing we hear in black society a lot from white Democrats, white people in general who actually, are empathetic is what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? I'm going to tell you, you're right to feel this weight. That's what I'm trying to get at. The situation is dire, but it's not impossible. If, and this is a holy if, right? White America is willing to do what it has never done fully before, which is metabolize memory without performance, mourn loss without supremacy, choose presence over dominance. This means no curation, no branding, no marketing, real work. And at this late hour, here's exactly what it would have required, okay? We're going to go through it step by step so you can clearly see what needs to happen. First thing we need is radical mourning without curation. This means directly, grieve publicly without spectacle, mourning the loss of ancestral innocence, spiritual belonging, and rootedness, not just mourning social privilege loss, right? Not that. Cry out the grief without trying to center it or sell it. And here's some concrete actions, just in case, right? This means local, unfilmed grief gatherings, no press, no hashtags, public rituals acknowledging the crimes of empire, not political rallies, but literal mourning ceremonies. White bodies sitting in fields, crying for land stolen, ancestors lost to conquest fever, souls lost to performance. Here's the phrase to remember with this. Mourn what we became without asking applause for mourning it. That's really what we want to see, right? Then here's the next thing. Rebuild rootedness without dominance. This means find cultural and ancestral memory before whiteness without using it as superiority. Okay, so this means reclaim the Scottish, Irish, German, Slavic, Norse, Jewish, Gaelic, present, indigenous to Europe memories, all of that. Go get all of that, right? Without turning them into armor. Okay, so this means some concrete actions. Here's some concrete actions. Family trees, right? Family tree projects, not to boast, but justifying the wounds. Oral history revivals about forgotten griefs, forced conversations, land losses, migration traumas, talking about it, actual oral history revivals, and rituals of returning to sacred humility, blessing rivers, replanting ancestral seeds, tending land without claiming it. Okay, here's the phrase to remember again, because I got one for all of them, because I need y'all to cook if you're going to try to do this. Okay, we're not blank slates of privilege. We are broken songs trying to remember the first words. Okay, this is the thing. All right, here's the next one. Sacred reparations without centering. So I want to see wealth, land, political space must be returned quietly, sacrificially, and permanently without branding it as goodness. So if reparations comes, I need to see no flags, no horns. It needs to just happen. No strings, no narratives of saving, no white savior ego rituals. This means quiet transfers of land and resources to Black, Indigenous, and historically erased communities. Legal advocacy that fights to dismantle the structures of extraction, not just decorate them, and paying reparations not as guilt payment, but as an act of restoring a broken timeline. Repair is not generosity. That's what I'm trying to get at. It's not generosity. Oh, look at all those Black people who went through this situation. That's not what's going on. You're doing this for you. It is the burial of stolen futures and the tending of new ones y'all no longer own. No one needs to own. Right? Free futures, actually, right? Then here's the next one. This is another one. This is another one. It's gonna be tough for people to hear. We need to see the death of the curated self. Let the good white person performance die. I'm just asking. Let it die. Stop trying to be the center of healing stories. Stop narrating yourself into every grief space. Okay, literally, deep sabbaticals need to happen from social media performance, especially performative allyship, especially. Building relational economies, barter, food sharing, spiritual labor sharing without spectacle, and taking leadership, right, from Black, Indigenous, and other memory-bearing communities without demanding to be included visibly, right? Included visibly. Okay, the thing is that if your face is always visible, you're still consuming the moment. That's the, you got to understand. Then we moving on. This is some more work for y'all to do. This whole thing should be considered homework. Okay, small scale covenant building. So sacred circles of metabolization at human scale. No giant institutions at first. I'm talking about home altars, fire circles, morning dinners, memory planting gardens, 5 to 10 people covenant circles focused on doing work, metabolizing, processing this grief, not branding. Local agriculture, spiritual stewardship projects tied to grief work. I don't want to see a new TikTok page pop up talking about we're changing the narrative. Go do it. Go do it. Sacred storytelling projects, true oral history spaces, oral memory spaces, right? Where failure, grief, and betrayal are named before any success is celebrated. Any. Rebuilt the world through sacred smallness, right? Not curated greatness. We don't need to see that happen again. So we're going to run through it again, just quickly. Radical mourning, grieve publicly without needing approval. Rooted restoration, reconnect to pre-whiteness cultural memory. Sacred reparations, return wealth and land without centering ego. Kill the center self. Stop narrating your goodness. Metabolize your grief. And small covenant communities. Sacred memory economies. Human scale. Quiet. Here's the truth. Because I need this to be locked in for anybody who's actually going to try. White America has to stop trying to survive as white America. It must survive as memory reborn. It must die to whiteness and be reborn in metabolized memory, rooted not in empire, but in tending to a broken orchid. Right? Here's the thing. All the history cooked. That's why the ancestry work was so high up. Okay, there is a broken line that needs to be restored in you, right? Okay, otherwise, whiteness will survive free, like physically, but spiritually it will freeze over. So think about this. Think about it like this. Imagine a house catching fire. Most people inside still think they have time to gather their trophies. But the few who will live, like who gonna make it out of that fire, they're gonna be the ones who walk out naked, trembling, and weeping, leaving the curated house behind. Not because they're better, but because they're finally willing to lose the image to keep the soul. You see what I mean? So, you know, if you're one of those people who are constantly asking, what can we do? What can we do? What kind of work can I do personally? This is it. This is it. Okay? Got your homework list. I don't even want to get back. I don't even want to be reported back to. Go outside. Ain't no book recommendations for this. Go outside. Do your work. Do your work. Okay? You wondering what's going on. It's your unrooted nature. Like, that's what's going on. Like, it's not going to work the same way. There's no forgery. There's no forging that you can do in this way. There's rebuilding to memory that was lost. So we're going to talk about the origins of empire logic. Now, stay with me, because this is one of those ones where we're going to be in the lab right now. So natural hardship is not new, right? Before the incident, humans survived ice ages. Humans survived mass migrations. We survived volcanic winters. But survival didn't sever memory yet. Grief was metabolized through ritual. Land was tended communally. Scarcity was absorbed through relational adaptability. Trauma happened, yes, but metabolization was stronger than fear. Then we had small climate fluctuations. So think around 5,000 to 4,000 BC. We see slight shifts in rainfall patterns, right? Some growing regions become less predictable. Seasonal failures start to happen more often. Nothing catastrophic yet, but this is anxiety, right, being born. So imagine small murmurs. What if next year is worse? What if we can't feed everyone? This is the first crack, right? Not the drought itself that we're about to get to, but the creeping fear that trust in cycles wasn't going to be enough anymore. So the thing is that this incident that we're about to refer to, known as the 4.2K kiloyear event, it appeared at a very unique time in human development, in the development of our brain and our perception, because we had lived communally with the land. And our relationship with the land was positive, and thus our relationship with God was positive, right? And really, here you start to see the appearance of the two parallel systems kind of starting to emerge. The keep, fear and chaos, right? Fear of chaos. Walls, hoarding, ritualized boundary making, locking food, locking land, locking people, and then the maw, which is the fear of being unseen. So hierarchies, kings, priests, recorders of legacy. If we don't control the story, we'll vanish, right? So the keep says build stronger walls, limit who could access abundance, suppress chaos. The maw says create hierarchies, glorify rulers, define legacy, dominate the narrative. Neither was a full empire yet, but they were spiritual distortions that appear really early, emerging not because humans were wicked, but because an unmet fear hadn't been metabolized, right? It had metasized like a cancer, right? So think of anxiety beginning to metasize, right? Like in a cancerous form, fear, right? Into structural patterns, actually forming into real life expressions of fear. So then we see writing, right, which is a ritualization of the keeping maw. So proto-writing appears in like 3500, right? So they track offerings, debts, harvests. Cities start recording not just what exists, but who owns what. Hierarchies get fossilized. Rituals shift from seasonal celebrations to king-centered propaganda. Writing becomes the first keep wall and the first maw mirror. Instead of a flowing memory, it was frozen law. Instead of relational storytelling, it was curated dominance. So in short, right, all of that was the pre-build-up to what is the 4.2K event, which is a mass erodization of around 150 to 300 years, right? And the places where empires showed up the strongest are places where the event targeted the worst. So that fragile complexity breaks completely, right? Fear metasizes into full empire logic at this point. So imagine a small village after a bad winter. Instead of singing the thaw back, they build walls, they count every seed, they elect a protector who speaks for the gods. Fear carves its first lines into the earth, and the river watches in silence, still ready to flow, but now distrusted, right? So here's really where the 4.2K event kind of gets in, just so you have a way to describe it. So starting off, right, in Mesopotamia, they had catastrophic droughts and salted the farmlands, right? The Twin Rivers shrank completely. The Akkadian Empire, the first real empire, collapsed, right, in the midst of this. Massive migrations and famines, cities like Uruk, Akkad, all fell into ruin or shrank drastically. And the spiritual impact is that the gods who once guaranteed abundance, right, seem to have abandoned humanity. Literally, right? This seeded the mythology of divine anger and chaos dragons and the need for kings to reconquer cosmic order. Ancient Egypt also was hit by this badly, right? The Nile's regular seasonal flooding failed catastrophically. Crops failed for decades. Old Kingdom collapsed, ushering in the chaotic first intermediate period. Massive political decentralization, like civil war. The Pharaoh's sacred role, right, cosmic balance was broken. People began to question divine favor itself, setting up for major religious transformations, including deep hunger for personal salvation and afterlife security. And then we see the Indus River Valley civilization, modern Pakistan, India, river systems dried, right, dramatically shifted. What's the name? Urban centers weathered, right? Trade networks with Mesopotamia collapsed because Mesopotamia is also getting hit by this. Population scattered into rural villages. Writing system disappears from archaeological record, never deciphered. Literally, this changes everybody on a spiritual level. That's what I'm trying to get y'all to understand. So we're going to publish a lot of this on Substack so y'all get a chance to read over this. But the big notion that I want people to understand is that the Killer Year event set the tone. The 4.2K event set the tone, right? So think about it like this. We have this event, like we were anxious before then, but once this happened, it was trauma codified. In Europe, who had now undergone severe desertification due to this event, right, had turned away from a lot of their religion. So believe it like this. Imagine you had a grandmother that was praying over the river, and for 3 to 5 generations, rain has never came. Well, at some point, it's, I don't need to pray, I need to take. Right? Once that happens, once the rains did return, their empire logic had formed. Rigid, like, they had formed rigid. Gotten intense. So, this is a rather intense one I'm studying. There's a lot to it. And, more will be on Substack. We'll get into that in another post. But this is a really serious event. And one of the things that you can hear about is, what about North and South America? Well, North and South America, you know, they went through it. They had localized famines, but no civilizational collapse. That was only in the old world. Right? Memory stayed tied to river cycles, animal migration, ancestor tending, seasonal harmonies. They didn't codify their trauma. Oral tradition remained alive, metabolizing, not frozen into domination scripts. Right? Even Central America, they have flexibility. South America, right? Did they have stress? Yes. Collapse? No. We are literally seeing the result of a mistake that occurred in the old world. Really is, right? Instead of grieving this large trauma that took place here, where there were like literal constant generations where they would have never seen a baby they would have never had a generation where more births happened than deaths. And this changed their relationship with God directly. So this is how you get from God as present here with us to Skyfather logic. Actually, the 4.2K Killer Year event is actually depicted in the beginning of the Bible. That's why everybody's starving in the beginning, right, due to this whole incident. So, this is just like a short overview of it. We'll definitely do a longer one, but hopefully this gave people some insight as to what went on.
During his lifetime, historian Noel Ignatieff was called one of the 10 most dangerous minds in America. And the reason why he was seen as so dangerous was for his call to abolish the white race. So what did he mean when he said we needed to end whiteness? To start to answer this question, we first have to understand what race and whiteness really is. In 2001, scientists made a revolutionary discovery. During the work of the Human Genome Project to map all of the genes in the human genome, researchers found that race is not real. In other words, racial categories like white and black are not biological or genetic facts, but social constructs. Science has shown that there is no gene common to all white or black people. In fact, there is far more genetic variation within racial groups than between racial groups. This scientific discovery supported what many people have always known, that racial categories were invented by human beings for political and social purposes and have absolutely no basis in biology. Science tells us that race is not real and skin color is simply an evolutionary adaptation. We know that modern humans evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago, and all humans were originally dark-skinned. White skin didn't appear until much later, around 12,000 to 7,000 years ago. And the white race is an even more recent development in human history. In fact, the idea of white and black racial categories is only a few hundred years old. Historian Nell Irvin Painter argues that there was no notion of race in the ancient world. And scholars like Ibram Kendi argue that race is a product of the 15th century and is directly tied to slavery. Before the Atlantic slave trade, there were no white people. There were the British, the French, the Portuguese, Protestants, and Catholics. Before the Atlantic slave trade, there were no black people either. Instead, there were thousands of unique African kingdoms, cultures, civilizations, and religions. It was the Atlantic slave trade that created white and black people. When Europeans began enslaving Africans, they suddenly became one entity, white. And the people they enslaved became one monolithic group too, black. Whiteness meant the freedom to enslave. Blackness was the mark of the slave. By 1751, we can hear Benjamin Franklin discussing this newly created white race. He wrote, "The English make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. I could wish their numbers were increased, and while we are making this side of our globe reflect a brighter light, why should we darken its people? Why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America, where we have so fair an opportunity by excluding all blacks of increasing the lovely white?" From this essay, we can see that the idea of a white race was only ever defined and discussed in the context of being separate and superior to black people. Whiteness could not exist outside of the context of slavery. That's why you could argue that it's a bit ridiculous to say things like, "I'm proud to be white," or ask, "Why don't we have a White History Month?" Because there is nothing to be proud of or celebrate when it comes to the invention of whiteness. The idea of a white race was invented for only one purpose, to argue that white people are superior to black people and therefore have a right to enslave them. Now, white people can be proud of many things. You can be proud of your family background, your country, your achievements, your morals, your roots. For example, I'm proud of my Irish and Native American heritage. I'm proud of my PhD and my role as a college professor and my political convictions. I'm proud to be a brother, a son, and an uncle. But to simply be proud of whiteness is to be proud of a history of slavery, racism, violence, and evil. To acknowledge these facts has nothing to do with white guilt or white shame. It's simply a recognition of the historical fact that whiteness was invented to justify the exploitation and abuse of people with darker skin. It's a recognition that the idea of whiteness has done more harm than any other idea in human history. On the other hand, black pride is something beautiful, powerful, and necessary. Because whereas whiteness was invented to justify the right to enslave and exploit black people, blackness came to represent the power to resist that abuse and find strength in suffering and adversity. Blackness was about fighting back against racism and discrimination and finding power in unity and solidarity. That's why we can smile when we hear James Brown sing, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud." But we should all recoil in horror if we ever heard a white artist sing, "Say it loud, I'm white and I'm proud." As Brown sang in 1968, "Some people say we got a lot of malice, some people say it's a lot of nerve, but I say we won't quit moving until we get what we deserve." Black pride has always been about fighting for their dignity and human rights, which they were denied for centuries. White pride has always been about fighting to strip those rights away from black people and forever treat them as second-class citizens. This is why the historian and activist Noel Ignatieff dedicated his life to a powerful but controversial idea. He argued that if whiteness could be created, it could also be destroyed. And he believed that abolishing whiteness was the only way to ever achieve true racial or social justice in America. Noel Ignatieff was born in Philadelphia in 1940 to a working-class family. In 1958, at the age of 17, he joined the Communist Party and began a long career of Marxist activism. For 20 years, Ignatieff worked in factories where he sought to educate his fellow workers on revolutionary theory and help them organize to fight capitalism. It was during these years that he concluded the greatest ideological barrier to the achievement of proletarian class consciousness, solidarity, and political action is now and has been historically white chauvinism, which he defined as the ideological bulwark of the practice of white supremacy, the general oppression of blacks by whites. Ignatieff declared that for the American working class to unite and overthrow capitalism, white workers had to reject their whiteness and lose their white skin privileges that separate them from the rest of the working class. He argued that white workers had to break away from their white privilege and fight back against the ideology and institution of white supremacy, which provides the illusion of common interest between the exploited white masses and the white ruling class. In the 1980s, when factory jobs began to disappear across the country, Ignatieff decided to go back to school and he was accepted into the Harvard graduate program, where he began work on his dissertation on the history of race in America. While at Harvard, Ignatieff started a magazine called Race Trader, and their motto was, "Treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity." He wrote that the aim of Race Trader is to abolish the white race, which is neither a biological nor a cultural formation, but a social construct, existing only because of the privileges its members enjoy within the state and the legacy of those privileges. When looking for a model of what it would look like to reject whiteness, Ignatieff turned to John Brown, who gave his life in the fight against slavery. In 1995, Ignatieff completed his dissertation, which was published as the book How the Irish Became White. He said he wanted to understand how the Catholic Irish, an oppressed race in Ireland, became part of an oppressing race in America. In the book, he shows how the Irish were not originally accepted into the white race by Americans. The way they became white was by joining in the white supremacist culture of supporting slavery and engaging in violence and discrimination against black people. Even though the book was an academic hit, he always had his critics. Some people interpreted his goal to abolish the white race as a call for violence and extermination, not realizing he was talking about the racist white mindset, not white people themselves. Ignatieff died in 2019 at the age of 78, but his ideas will always be relevant in a society still poisoned by white supremacy and racial discrimination. Years before the Human Genome Project definitively proved that race is not real, Ignatieff knew the greatest truth of all: the only race is the human. During his lifetime of activism and scholarship, many of his friends were pessimistic and believed that America would never change and always be corrupted by its original sin of slavery and its long history of racism. But whenever anyone would begin to despair, Ignatieff would tell them, "If we can just change 5 people's minds, we can change the world." I don't know if I'm that optimistic. I'll take just one.
These two girls are a perfect example of why race is a social construct. Hear me out. Lucy and Maria are sisters. In fact, they're fraternal twin sisters, but many people would look at them and think they're not related. In fact, you'd probably think that Lucy identifies as white and Maria identifies as black. But this is their mom, who we probably would say is racially black. But because these two girls could self-identify differently, they'd be treated differently by the US healthcare system. For Maria, US racial corrections would say she should have different lung, kidney, and heart functioning than her sister. That means compared to her twin sister, Maria is less likely to have a lung transplant, less likely to have a kidney transplant, and less likely to have a heart transplant, just because of her race. The problem is, even though these two sisters aren't any genetically different than any other pair of siblings, they'd be treated differently by the medical system. And that makes no sense.
Race is a social construct. You've probably heard that a lot, but what does it actually mean? In 2000, a draft of the Human Genome Project was completed. It was a map of the complete human genome and the genes that make us who we are. One of its conclusions was that a genetic marker for race did not exist, meaning you can't look at someone's DNA and determine what race they are. In fact, there's more genetic variation within racial groups than between them. Race is a construct because there's no way to measure race. Sometimes we do it by skin color, sometimes we do it by hair texture. At one point in history, we divided race differently even based within skin colors. Think of the word mulatto that was used in the 19th century. What's black in the United States is not what's black in Brazil or in South Africa. And in the 1940s, what was black is not what's black today. Even whiteness has evolved too. If you were Irish or Italian arriving in the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you weren't considered white. Although race isn't real, that doesn't mean race doesn't have real-world effects. Race is given power through policies, actions, and behaviors.
To read this book, it's called, everybody has to read this. Everybody that's watching this has to read this book on tyranny. 20 things that we've learned over the last 100 years in this country that have put us in the position we're in now and what we can do about it. Everybody has to read this book. They should read this book first, and then they should read The Myth of Race by Robert Wald Sussman. And once you've read The Myth of Race, you will never, ever again go along with the idea that there are 3 or 4 or 5 different races. It was a lie made up by the people who ran the Spanish Inquisition. And before that, there were different colors, but race had nothing to do. There was only one race, the human race. We made that whole thing up. It's time to get rid of it. We have the power to do that. This country got ready for World War II in about 6 months. And you're telling me that we can't destroy racism? White people created racism. Anything you create, you can destroy. God created human beings, the human race, and they started out black women. White people created racism. Human beings created racism. It's time to get over it.
Can we go back 1 second?
Sure you can.
You criticized President Trump.
Did I?
One thing that a lot of people have criticized former President Obama on was not speaking out on race enough. Do you think he failed in that?
What if he had spoken out enough on race? Imagine what would have happened to him. The man is still alive. Do you remember Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Do you remember Malcolm X? Do you remember all those people have been killed not because of the color of their skin, but because of the fear of white people that someone who isn't white is going to look better, sound better, act better, do better than they do? Mr. Obama was the president of all of us. He wasn't just the president of black people. He was the president of all of us. The man who's there now is and claims to be the president of the people who look like him. When he says, "Make America great again," what he's really saying is, "Make America hate again."